Alrighty, so afternoon. Here we are in lesson 13 of our series on church history, Christ's Church through the ages. And as I explained to you in last week's announcements, we're covering onto now the ante-Nicene fathers, meaning before Nicaea, before the Council of Nicaea in 325, and we're covering one of the most prominent of those, especially and more particularly in terms of the volume of writing from this individual. And this is, of course, Irenaeus of Lyon. As I explained previously, we're going to be doing this in two parts, so that we can cover enough detail and so the lessons aren't too gigantic. The two smaller lessons that will then be done across this week and next week, part 1, part 2. And so, as usual, especially for this kind of week, where we're basically all we're doing today is getting a bit of a biography on Irenaeus, a bit of an explanation of the details we know from his life, and then a cursory look at one of his most famous work, his magnum opus called, which in English we refer to as Against Heresies. And we'll have some quotations from that to give you a bit of idea, but then next week, part 2, we'll just be specifically focusing on that famous work of his, which serves as a vitally important kind of bedrock theological work, one of the earliest and essentially pretty much the earliest kind of complete theological treatise, as it were. It's one of the most prominent theological works as a body of work that we have from the early church, and so it's an important one. We'll cover that in the more specific kind of the outline of it and some of the content. Obviously, if we were to go through it, we would be spending months and months and months, but we'll give you the more specific detailing next week, okay? So here, lesson 13, and so let's just go through a biography of Irenaeus of Lyon. So you'll notice there on the front page there, you have, this is actually a stained glass window from a church in Lyon named in his honour, in what's called modern day Lyon, France. Historically, back especially in Irenaeus' day, Lyon, which is in the east of France, was known as Lugdunum. And that we'll get onto that as we go through his biography. But this is a very nice stained glass window there in the church of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon in Lyon. It says there beneath his feet Sanctus Irenaeus, which is Latin, of course, being a Western, what we call one of the Western fathers, aka a Latin father. He himself was Greek. He was actually from Smyrna, and we'll get onto the biography in a minute, but in the church in the West where Latin was more primarily used. There is, and this is not much of the focus today, but interesting detail to point out that if you look there at the bottom of the stained glass window, kind of beneath his feet, beneath that title Sanctus Irenaeus, which means Holy Irenaeus, or Saint Irenaeus in this specific terminology, you see a wreath, a circular wreath there, in between those two birds. Again, if we were to go through and explain all the details here, there's some interesting ones, including the lions up the top. But in the middle there is an important symbol in Christianity, one which we'll cover, I suppose, probably in more detail when we get onto Constantine, because that's where it finds its genesis. It looks to you like an X and a P, I imagine. I'm seeing some head nods. Pardon me. This is what's called the hero, all right? Not hero, but he, the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, or Chi, you can say it in English, Chi-ro, okay, hero. He and ro as Greek letters are the first two letters of the word Christos, Christ, okay? The P, the letter, the Greek letter that looks like a P is actually an R, and the he or the Chi part looks like an X, okay? Those are Greek letters. And put together, they form the symbol called the Chi-ro. This becomes a really important symbol through Constantine a couple of centuries later after this point, about 150 years later. We'll cover that when we get to that point. But early Christians used a whole variety of different symbols. Of course, probably one of the most famous for us, not just as Protestants, but the common one among evangelicals or Baptists specifically, is what we call the Latin cross, which is just a very plain, unstylized cross. Different cross variations have been used throughout history. A Greek cross is just a symmetrical cross that's even on all sides. A Byzantine cross, which became famous during the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire, which was Christian, has 3 bars on it, one for where the arms would have been, one for where the name king of the Jews would have been up the top, and then one where the feet would be. All these are just symbols, and letters were one of the early ones that, for one reason or another, early Christians in the ancient church were naturally attracted to and used quite often. And there are a number of those, and we'll cover those as we go through, but I just wanted to point out one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of the letters that are used there in what's called the names of Christ, or the staurograms. So, turning through the actual details you see now there for the biography on page 2 of your notes there. So, Irenaeus was born in and around the year AD 130, so I've said there specifically circa 130. We know for a fact he was born either somewhere between 120 and 140, so we usually just in history split the difference and call it 130. And he was born in Smyrna, in Asia Minor. Now, for those who were here in our last lesson, when we covered the last of the apostolic fathers, Polycarp of Smyrna, they were both from Smyrna. In this case, Irenaeus was taught and was led by Polycarp. He knew Polycarp well, of course. Polycarp was his bishop. And for this kind of reason, we consider in church history Irenaeus to be essentially the last living connection, so a word of the apostles. He didn't know the apostles, right? So John had passed away obviously well before this. John, keeping in mind, to remind you, passed away in AD 100 in Ephesus. This is obviously decades after this. So he is in referring to Irenaeus, is not counted as an apostolic father because he didn't know the apostles personally. But he knew and was taught and was raised and was led in the church by Polycarp, who did know John. Okay, all these kinds of details. I know it seems like I'm making the same point over and over on that part, but what I'm doing is really highlighting to us that, again, kind of like what I mentioned in the sermon about eyewitnesses and about the knowing and having a faith of things that are not just convoluted, contrived myths, but rather are coming from actual sources of evidence. Irenaeus is writing about who Jesus is, and he's not just getting it from some nice fanciful ideas that he came up with on a stroll through the park one day. He's getting it from someone who, in the case of John, saw the transfiguration, saw Christ raised from the dead, right? He's getting it from him through Polycarp, okay? So he's talking and he's taught by someone who did know the apostles, in this case John. One thing that's interesting about Irenaeus is that unlike many other of the more renowned early church fathers, especially like the apostolic fathers, Polycarp is actually born and raised in a Christian home. Sorry, pardon me. Irenaeus is actually born and raised in a Christian home. Okay, he's raised in a Christian family, so he's not like other contemporaries who are usually converted out of Greek paganism or out of one of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, so like the Stoics or the Epicureans, the Neoplatonists by this time in history at least. He's born and raised in a Christian family. He's in that respect more like Timothy, for example. Right? He may recall the Apostle Paul when he writes to Timothy, the two letters we have. He encourages and extols Timothy for having been raised in the household of faith that his mother and grandmother have. Okay, similar kind of scenario. He has Christian mother and father, Christian parents. He was a priest or a presbyter. Those kinds of words historically are synonymous. The word priest comes from the word presbyteros, right, or presbyter, which is where we usually translate into English as elder, right, from the New Testament. All those terms are synonymous with each other. So whether you call it an elder, a presbyter, like a priest, those terms are synonymous. He's priest or presbyter of the church of what I said in the beginning was at the time Lugdunum, which today we know as Lyon in French. And this is in the region of Gaul, which today is modern-day France. And he was presbyter at the time in that church. He was priest in that church during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. So that's the date that we have indicated, not only from his sources, but also figures like Eusebius, who's the first major church historian. Marcus Aurelius is Roman emperor from AD 161 to AD 180. But during that time, a significant persecution comes, especially towards the end of Marcus Aurelius' reign in the AD 177, and a number of, and when I say not just a general one, but in certain specific areas, and in this case Lugdunum or Lyon was one of those places. A number of the Christians at the church at Lugdunum or Lyon were coming under that persecution. Somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 that we know of were killed. There's some evidence it may have been more than that, but there's certainly, at least in terms of how we've confirmed those historically from records, it's at least around 50, right? So it's dozens and dozens of Christians who die and who are executed and or just simply die through torture in prison in the year AD 177. But during that year, as the persecution has been unleashed in Lyon, Irenaeus, as one of the priests obviously in the Church of Lyon, is sent to the Church of Rome, which planted the church at Lyon, keeping in mind that any church in the West, right, so Western Europe, so this is places like Iberia, which was known as Hispania, which we get the word Spain from, places like Gaul, which today we call France, or even the province of Britannia, those churches are ultimately, one way or another, either directly or indirectly planted by the Church of Rome in the early days, okay? Even ones like Britain. Aristobulus, who brings Christianity to Britannia, the Roman province of Britannia in AD 54, he is originally from the east, so he's originally over from places like Judea and Samaria. He then travels to the Church of Rome. He then spends time in the Church of Rome, building it up as well, and then he is sent as a missionary forth from the Church of Rome to Britannia. Does that make sense? Even centuries later, 600 years nearly after Aristobulus first brought Christianity to the Celtic Britons, so like my ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons by this time have arrived from what today we call Germany and southern Denmark. They're pagan, they're Germanic people, so they're not indigenous to Britain. But as pagans then, the Church of Rome once again, in the days of Gregory the Great, who was Bishop of Rome in those days, sends forth a man named Augustine, not to be confused with Augustine of Hippo, but this is Augustine of Canterbury, and he arrives in Canterbury, the land of the Kents, and brings the gospel to them also. Okay, so in one way or another, the Church of Rome has been the defining church that God has worked through in the Western world. Does that make sense? And this is a very similar case. So the reason why he's coming back to the Church at Rome to bring a letter is because of how important the Church of Rome was in the Western world. Okay, and that letter is sent ultimately from the then Bishop of Lyon, Eleftherius, who is at that time imprisoned with, in this specific instance, 5 other Christians. He's executed. The other Christians, as far as I recall from the historical sources, just simply die under torture in prison. Many of them were kind of like we've already seen all 3 of the apostolic fathers that we looked at die by martyrdom. One of them, of course, being Ignatius, who himself is condemned to damnatio bestia, right, death or damnation by beast, so he's fed to the lions. A number of them in Lugdunum were fed to the lions as well. The amphitheatre, which is actually in Lyon, is still there to this day. It's in ruins, obviously, but you can go and visit it. That's where a number of Christians in that year, AD 177, were killed, they were beheaded, they were crucified, they were fed to the lions. And many of them, as I said, died just under torturous conditions in prison. They were essentially tortured to death. This all happens while he is sending that letter. The primary reason for the letter was to detail to Rome, to the Church of Rome, what was going on, basically giving a report, essentially, of what was going on in Lugdunum, in Lyon, of the conditions. It was saying, it was giving testimony on the part of the Bishop Eleftherios to the Bishop of Rome that we're persevering, we're not falling away, we're not apostatizing, we're staying strong in the faith even under this trial and persecution. And then it was also to discuss a theological issue which was called the Montanist heresy. Now this is a favourite of mine to talk about. The Montanist heresy, and this is not the focus here, so I'm only going to be brief. The Montanist heresy was otherwise known in Greek by a word that we translate into English as the new prophecy. Okay. It was otherwise called the Montanist heresy, or the group were called the Montanists, because their leader, their founder, Montanus or Montanius, provided the name for the group. The essential fundamental beliefs, in brevity, because again it's not the focus, of the Montanists, which had arisen in the 2nd century, was that they were receiving new prophetic revelation from the Holy Spirit, and they would go into a kind of ecstatic trance. They would start speaking in garbled languages. They would fall and writhe on the ground, and things that I'm seeing some people smiling at, because you may or may not be getting where I'm going at. Just about everything you see in the charismatic movement. okay, which has arisen in the last 100 years of the church, or specifically the last 50. All the things like we're receiving a new divine revelation from the Holy Spirit, and we're speaking in tongues, quote unquote, but none of them are human languages. It's this angelic divine language, which means nothing. And we're saying, thus saith the Lord, blah, da, 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 da. And we're being slain in the Spirit, we're falling on the ground, and we're rolling and rolling around. It's exactly what this is. Literally, you can compare the two and just see that they are quite literally identical. Sadly and unfortunately, the charismatic movement, from that Greek word charisma, is nothing more than the resurrection of the Montanist heresy, which was declared heresy by everyone in the early church. So the question of, is this the way that the early church behaved? No, because it was universally declared to be heresy by the very early church that supposedly did this. So when I levy criticisms at the charismatic movement, it's not out of some vain blindness that I'm just some religious curmudgeon who doesn't like people clapping hands in church. It's actually because I know history and I know exactly what the Montanists believe, and the charismatics believe essentially the exact same thing. All of these practices which were condemned as heresy. Okay, so there's a historical basis for things like that. During this time, as I mentioned, when he's actually in Rome delivering the letter, the bishop of Lyon, Eleftherios, who was the first bishop, because the church had been planted pretty recently. The church at Lugdunum had been planted, we think, somewhere around probably 130, 140, 150-ish, maybe 160. It's about that time. Maybe even just into the beginning of Marcus Aurelius' reign in 161. But long story short, it was a relatively newer church in Lyon, or in Lugdunum, which was an important part of Gaul. And so Irenaeus is then, by the time he then returns to Lyon, is appointed then as the new, and in this case, the second bishop of Lyon. Okay, so the leading bishop, or the leading presbyter among the other presbyters, right? So that's the basis of our of what we got there. You've also then got a further explanation of these various details, especially that you can keep going on with. Ironically, not much to speak of him becoming bishop, not much is actually known about Irenaeus' time when he was a bishop, which is odd because you'd expect it to be that way. We know more about his time as a priest, as a presbyter, right, a clergyman, than as the bishop of Lyon, which is ironic, because most of those details, like when we cover the Apostolic Fathers, comes from their time as, like Polycarp being Bishop of Smyrna. But nonetheless, he writes a number of, there are some brief details that we do know, and I haven't put them in the writing there just because they're so brief. He clearly, through his writings, especially in Against Heresies, but also other writings that we attribute to Irenaeus, clearly maintained, even as bishop, which is a more administrative role per se. He is a leader in that city among the churches. He's leading all the various other bishops, right, the various other presbyters as the bishop, definite article, yet still maintains a very clear, pastoral care for the churches and for the what we'd say the laity, right? For all the people in the church. He's preaching seems to be preaching pretty regularly, even as bishop, and maintains a very clear pastoral sensibility about him. It's quite nice when you read, even though the details are brief, it's quite nice when you read about his time as bishop. But nonetheless, one of the most famous, not one of, the most famous work of Irenaeus as Bishop of Lyon throughout his life is his work against heresies. And so what we'll do is just go some again, brief details. What is the document? That's really what we're focusing on today. And we'll have some quotations to give you a bit of a taste test, as it were, before next week in part 2 of Irenaeus, we'll actually go through some of the more structural elements and some of the more key details of it. So you'll see that again, continuing through page 2 of your study notes. The full title, I've translated out of the Greek for you, is on the detection and overthrow of the so-called gnosis. I'll explain what that word gnosis means in a minute, but either way, a pretty strong title to call your book, on the detection and overthrow, detecting and overthrowing. The abbreviated title that is part of the work is what's in Latin. Again, keep in mind he's a Western father. He's Greek from the east, but he's in Lyon in the west, which is primarily using Latin. Adversus Heresis. which means against heresies. Okay, it's written in and around the year AD 180, roughly speaking, which was at the beginning of his time as bishop. Keeping in mind that he comes, we can date his beginning to AD 177 when Eleftherios, the previous bishop, dies. So this is in the early years of his bishopric, as his time as bishop. And therein, in Against Heresies, which is just how I'll refer to it from going forward, he's covering a variety of different heretical cults that had arisen, that are kind of broken away from Christianity in the first 150 years, which we're up to now, nearly 200 years. But a primary focus upon two big ones, one of them bigger than the other, but what we call Gnosticism and Marcionism. Okay, I'll touch on Marcionism briefly because that's the smaller of the two. Marcionism, again, it's one of those what we call an eponymous title, which means it's named after the founder, Marcion. I've referenced this before a couple of times in sermons. In simple terms, the condensed version of what did the Marcionites believe, their fundamental belief was that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were two different gods. Okay, so the Old Testament Yahweh was this violent, barbaric, tyrannical, evil demiurge, so to speak, and the New Testament God, Jesus essentially, was the nice, kind, loving, empathetic, compassionate one. Okay, and that the Bible can be basically split in two: the Old Testament about the old, tyrannical, curmudgeonly God, and the New Testament about the new, nice, peaceful, hippie God. I'm putting some spin on that, but that's essentially what it amounted to. And it's basically that the Bible is the conquest of the new, nice God over the old, evil one. Okay. It technically comes under the banner of Gnosticism, but because Gnosticism is a very broad banner, it's an umbrella term that we use for a number of different things as theologians and church historians, but nonetheless, that's essentially what the Marcionites believed. So that's why you've heard me sometimes probably reference how at times certain people or certain churches can kind of wade into a kind of semi-Marcionism, like a soft Marcionism, where you focus so heavily on the New Testament and on the Gospels, and either implicitly or otherwise consider all the Old Testament stuff, especially about the law, to be that Old Testament stuff which doesn't apply anymore. Like that kind, especially, and you see this encapsulated in phrases like, we're under grace, not under law, right? Now, whilst that's a biblical statement, like Paul does say that, it's ripping it out of context, because if you keep reading what Paul says, Paul's whole point is, we are under grace, not under the law of God, but is this an excuse for us to cast off the law? God forbid. That's quite literally what he says. No, instead we actually do works of love from faith, not because we're trying to earn merit in the sight of God. Do you make sense? The whole point of why we're going through Deuteronomy in an expository fashion is not because Deuteronomy is an irrelevant book at all. No, it's because it's entirely relevant. The New Testament authors, all the apostles knew this, absolutely. For starters, the law points us to Christ, because he is the fulfillment of the law. He upholds the law perfectly. He dies as a consequence of taking upon himself the curse of sin that comes from our law breaking. And in doing so, he dies, is buried, and then rises from the dead in victory to acquire for us many things, one of which is liberty in Christ. Not liberty to do whatever we want, but freedom within the good and natural bounds, the order of God's creation, and particularly of the kingdom of God. Okay, we've said this before plenty of times. Liberty doesn't come from casting off boundaries, but from rather having clearly defined ones. Okay, ask any farmer this principle, and they'll tell you what the answer is, whether they're Christian or not. Don't have a fence on your property, and you have turf wars, and you have people arguing over where my property ends and where yours begins. Your cattle comes over and grazes on my plots, right? And the animals get in, the wolves get in, in our case in Australia, the dingoes get in, etc., etc., etc. Right? Boundaries provide order, and it's within order that freedom exists, not boundlessness. That's what the West is learning the hard way now. But anyway, point being, that's what Marcionism was. Gnosticism, which is a much broader term than Marcionism, a number of different cults were called Gnostic cults, and this is where that word Gnosos I'll now explain. So Gnosos Greek word means knowledge. Okay, so this is where in English we get the word agnostic from. So if someone claims to be an agnostic, they're claiming, I'm not a hardline atheist, I'm not saying there is no God, but the agnostic says, I don't know if there's a God, I don't know what to believe, etc., etc. I do it politely, but I like to point out to agnostics, self-professed agnostics, that the Latin equivalent of that is ignoramus, which is where we get the word ignoramus from. And it's not meant to be an unnecessary jab, but when you call yourself an agnostic, it's not my opinion, you are quite literally calling yourself an ignoramus, because that's what that word means, right? It means without knowledge. So it's kind of ironic that an agnostic is trying to tell you that there's probably no God, when the entire point of why they call themselves agnostic means I don't know. So you're trying to convince me of something which you're claiming to be ignorant of. Doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, Gnosos means knowledge. And so the basic premise, and again, this looked different depending on the Gnostic cult, and we'll get into this as we go through, particularly mainly next week, when we look at this a bit more specifically through Irenaeus' work against heresies. But point being, the basic premise that applied to all the Gnostic cults was a couple of things, but the primary one was that we have this secret esoteric knowledge. Okay, it was occultic in that sense. Occultus in Latin meaning hidden. So it's a secret knowledge, right? That you kind of like concentric. And this is how cults often work, right? Because cults, even on a basic level, sometimes can just be a Gnostic cult, even the foundational principle. But cults tend to work where you've got people on the outside. There's a really hard line, us and them, okay? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because people do that all the time, right? But there's then these like concentric circles, so circles within circles of, you get through the first barrier, and that's getting someone to become interested in the cult. And then they start to become inquisitive, so you give them some of the basic information next. And then you gradually keep just moving them in. But there are things that have to be done all along the way. If you're a smart cult like Scientology, you make it through payment, where you don't progress your way through all the levels of Scientology without having to pay, by the end of it, literally millions of dollars. So that's a good pyramid scheme if there ever was one. And either way, though, point being, with Gnostic cults, it was the same kind of form. You have various levels of knowledge, and the initiate has to work their way through all these processes before they arrive at the inner sanctum, so it were, if they ever even did, by the way, of here's who Jesus really is. Do you understand? So keeping in mind, all of this is with the claim of following Jesus. Okay, this is completely antithetical to actual historic Christianity, to biblical Christianity. You'll never find the apostles in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, for example, saying to people that, Jesus is this hidden figure, this secret one, and we're here to bring you in gradually and slowly over the course of years, if not decades, into this secret knowledge of who Jesus truly is. All the other people are saying so, but we know the true secret, and we want to reveal the secrets to you, all these kinds of things. No, they just reveal the secrets. The mystery is revealed, right? The mystery is already revealed, right? He revealed it when he very publicly died, very publicly was buried, and very publicly rose from the dead. There's nothing esoteric in that sense. Does that make sense? There's nothing occultic. There's nothing hidden. Very publicly born, very publicly lives, very publicly dies, very publicly is raised from the dead, very publicly it's all public. It's actually the opposite of esoteric. Okay, this is why the apostles speak about, especially Paul, about the great mystery having been revealed, the mystery of the incarnation, right, being revealed, because God literally revealed. He's a God of knowledge. He's a God of light. Okay, the apostle John says that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Right, so playing light off against darkness, there's nothing hidden. Okay, especially now, post-incarnation, God has been fully revealed to the world. There's nothing esoteric, right? Anyone can, especially now in our day, post-printing press and with the internet and everything else, anyone can read the Bible. There's nothing hidden. All you have to do is just get you a copy. It's very simple. So it's the opposite of a cult, right? The polar opposite, actually. It's the opposite of esoteric, right? Because Christianity truly is a religion of light. not of veiled secrecy, not of light that's like hidden and secret from the outside world, where unless you come and listen to this charismatic leader talk, you're not going to have the secrets revealed to you, right? Anyone can pick up a Bible, anyone can read the words of God, and by the grace of God come to know them, and that can all be done, ironically, completely independently of any Christian even going out there and doing it, right? Plenty of people have converted to Christianity without ever having talked to a Christian, and then they join a church after the fact, and that's not the common way, but that's happened. I know people like that, right? Who, in a time of, they were in a rough period in their life, and they were staying in some shoddy motel somewhere, and what was in the bedside table? The Gideon's Bible. Right? How many times is that story? I know multiple people like that, right? Because of the work that Gideon's as an organisation, Christian organisation, has done in getting Bibles into as many hotel and motel rooms in the world as possible, right? I know people who have converted like that, right? That's the opposite of esoteric. Christianity is not esoteric. It's not secret. It's a religion of light, not of shadows. Does that make sense? Okay? And so that's what Gnosticism is, and that's the simplest possible way. Fundamentally, another commonality between the Gnostics, Jesus was a divine being, an elevated being. He was not eternally God. Okay? They did not believe that Jesus was the eternal God. Okay? They believed, again, this looked differently depending on the different Gnostic cults, but one of the common beliefs was that he was kind of like, and this is why the context is important, right? Gnosos is a Greek word. This heresy arose in the Greek world, in the Hellenistic world. Jesus to the Gnostics was very much like Heracles or like Achilles, right? A demigod, a champion, a hero, right? The word hero comes from the Greek, heros, which means the champion or a triumphant one. He was a hero, a demigod that had part divine, part human origin. So that's just like Heracles, which you probably know better by his Latin name, Hercules. That's just like Achilles. That's just like Perseus or Theseus or various other Greek heroes from the ancient Greek world, who was elevated to the level of the gods, like Heracles was. Okay? Heracles with a human mother and a divine father, in this case Zeus, who was a demigod, part man, but not like Jesus actually is, which is we don't believe that. He's not a demigod. He's not just like 50% God, 50% man. Fully God, 100% God, 100% man. Okay? And he was elevated and esteemed and was to be worshipped. But you can see hopefully the comparison I'm drawing between the Greek heroes and the Greek demigods with how they then viewed Jesus. It was a blending between true biblical Christianity and Greek paganism. And when you mesh things like that, you don't get good consequences. History has proven that. That's a very basic belief in Gnosticism, okay? And that'll inform us by the time we get to the 4th century, so the 300s, as to when the church is now dealing with Arianism, named after its founder, Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Alexandria, as to why they believe that. It's Gnostic influence, okay? Because the Arians were the most obvious example of people who believed that Jesus was a divine being, high, exalted and elevated, but was not God, not eternally God. He was the first and greatest creature. See the problem? Yep. That'll become important as we kind of work our way through. So what we have is, I'm just going to give you a couple of quotations from the various books of Against Heresies. Again, we'll go through the structure and everything next week, but this is just to whet your appetite, as it were, and to go through some of the details that we'll go through in more constructive detail next week. So this is taken from, just by the way, for this week and next week, when you see the way I've categorized it, you'll notice that at the end of the various quotations, the actual designator of where this is taken from. So the first number, technically a letter, is not the letter 1, it's Roman numerals, so 1 is in the letter I. You see that if you look down the end of page 2, there's 2 in Roman numerals. So that's book 1, if you take the first one for example, book 1, chapter 10, and then basically paragraph or section 2, okay? And so if you're ever reading through it, that's what these markers are meaning. It's just giving you basically the chapter and the book, the chapter and the verse, kind of like we would say, 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16. It's essentially the same kind of thing, the way we categorise this particular work against heresy. So the first quotation taken from Book 1, chapter 10, section 2 is as follows. As I have already observed, the church, having received this preaching and this faith, although scattered throughout the whole world, the oikumene, the inhabited world, yet as if occupying but one house, carefully preserves it. Okay, this faith he's referring to. She also believes these points of doctrine just as if she had but one soul and one in the same heart, and she proclaims them and teaches them and hands them down with perfect harmony, as if she possessed only one mouth. A big reason, again, why Irenaeus is writing this is, of course, as the title suggests, he is fighting against heresies. Okay, one of the most important, not anyone, we'll go through this next week, but one of the most important bases that he uses, the foundational principles he uses to actually combat the heresies, is he's demonstrating that the truth in his day, so late 2nd century, has remained unchanged going back to the apostles. Okay, so I mentioned this, I think it must have been under Ignatius of Antioch. I'm pretty sure that's where I mentioned this point. Apostolic succession is actually quite an important thing. Now, the way that that's been understood throughout the different Christian traditions has varied. Churches like the Church of Rome or the Eastern churches or the Church of England, so Anglicanism, hold it to be more of a personal apostolic succession, so the nature of having successive bishops and by extension presbyters, right, other bishops, laying on of hands and commissioning them into the office of the ministry. That's the important aspect, because it's this bishop teaching the next bishop, or like this presbyter, this pastor teaching the next pastor, that kind of transmission. Whereas other of the what we call the magisterial reformers, so others like Calvin, etc., held in the more Reformed tradition. So these are branches like Presbyterianism, Congregationalists, even Reformed Baptists like us. That's been more of again, apostolic succession through the teaching element. Okay, so you don't need an unbroken list, like a roll of all the pastors or the bishops of the church going all the way back to one of the apostles, but rather it's a consistency of the teaching down throughout the ages. That's the true apostolic succession. So again, different Christian traditions have had different opinions on how this actually plays out, but the basic reality of apostolic succession is important. Okay, it's just like how different Christian traditions have had different understandings or different opinions on what exactly is going on in Holy Communion. Well, all of them agree that Holy Communion is a necessary sacrament that we should all be doing. Okay, that's the foundational truth. The way it's been understood has varied, right? Sometimes for the better, sometimes not for the better. But same thing with apostolic succession, right? Because there are a lot of people, and Baptists tend to be, not Reformed Baptists, but what we call General Baptists, right? Tend to be guilty of this, but some other denominations do also, where they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and apostolic succession sounds a bit too Roman Catholic for my liking, so let's get rid of it. Except the problem is that the Reformers never believed that. The Reformation was not about throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because then it would have just been called the Revolution. Right, it was called the Reformation. It was reforming that which already existed. It was one of the best ways I've ever heard this encapsulated when people argue, like in Church of Rome, when they argue, where was your church before Martin Luther or John Calvin or John Knox for the Presbyterian? The argument back is, well, where was your face before you washed it that morning? Right, things had gotten unclean, things had gotten muddy, right, as they did in the late medieval period. I admit that more than anyone else, and the thing needed to be cleaned up. Right, we need to get rid of some of the gunk, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We unfortunately are in a time where 500 years later, far too many churches have actually thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and now what they do any given Sunday during a worship service is irrecognisable with regards to the historic practices of the church. They don't have a liturgy, the readings mean nothing, they've never heard of the creeds, they've never heard of confessions, they can't name even 3 of the early church fathers. It's a train wreck, right? Because that's what happens when you don't teach church history, and when pastors don't know church history, and you're disconnected from everything else that's come before you, and you're just floating around on a little island going a whole lot of nowhere. Right? It's not to sound harsh, but the point that gets made here is one of Irenaeus' primary defences is showing how in his day, all of not even, like barely 200 years later, from the beginning of like when Christ dies, for example, and rises from the dead, that's nearly 200 years, nearly 150-ish years, that he can show the apostolic succession, not just of the people, because for himself it was really important that he learnt from Polycarp, who learnt from John. That's a central argument to him in against heresies. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Yep. And so apostolic succession is a fundamental component, and that's what he's using here in this quite poetic way. Even though the church is spread throughout the world, right? It's from the British Isles all the way to India, west to east. It's up in Gaul, on the borders of the Rhine, where the empire ends and the Germanic barbarians begin. It's all the way down in Ethiopia. Ethiopia becomes Christian very early on through the work of the apostle Matthew. And so all around the world, as far east as you can, so as far east as you can go, as far west as you can go, the gospel is already there, right? It is all over the world. Yet her teachings, right, though she's scattered around the whole world, it's as if she's occupying the one house, right? It's as if she speaks with the one voice. She beats with the one heart, so it were, right? Because again, we are all enjoined by the one and the same Spirit, right? One Lord, one faith, one baptism, right? And so there should be unity. Now, it's not unity negating truth. You don't ignore errors for the sake of unity, because that's entirely contradictory to what the early church fathers did. They didn't sacrifice truth in the pursuit of unity. They called for unity in the truth. Does that make sense? The truth was the unifying factor. Okay, if a church or if people in a church went off the rails and shot off into some other cult, you're the ones who have abandoned, right? The train's heading this way and you jumped off it, okay? It doesn't matter what the volume is. This lesson is going to become really important when we get to Athanasius of Alexandria, who's one of the most important, one of the most influential of the early church fathers that we have, because by his day in the early 300s, 150-ish years after this time period, most, not all, but most of the bishops in the cities in the eastern half of the world have fallen into the Arian cult. They've apostatized, and they're leading their churches down that road. Okay, so we get to it. I won't, I'm not going into it now, obviously, because I'll save it for that day. But the famous phrase which his contemporaries attached to him and became kind of like a moniker was Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius is a Latin name, but Athanasius contra mundum, meaning Athanasius against the world. Okay, because as far as it looked from Athanasius' perspective, it was almost as if Athanasius was the only bishop in the East who hadn't committed heresy, who hadn't fallen in heresy yet. And he was exiled 5 times and kept getting restored. He never even wanted to become bishop in the first place, but the Alexandrian church demanded that of him because he was, let's be honest, he was a talent. He was a talented theologian, talented minister. And his life story is incredibly fascinating. But we'll get into that when we get to him. So, point being, the unity of the church is not forsaking truth, but rather unity in the truth. Okay? So, second quotation you have there, and this is a pairing from book 2, okay? One from chapter 9, one from chapter 28. So I'll read the first one there from book 2, chapter 9, section 1. For even creation reveals him who formed it, and the very work made suggests him who made it, and the world manifests him who orders it. This is speaking to, this is where in book 2 Irenaeus is speaking to God as the creator of the world, the creator of all things, the one who ordered the world, right, in ancient times. And then he's highlighting the fact that Christ is the Logos, and he's tying it to this concept of truth, okay, that God is able to be known, right, that the Logos, the Word, was made flesh, and that's where you get that second quotation there. So if you, it's on the screen there, but if you flip to your the second side there, page 3 of your study notes, you'll see the continuation in chapter 28. For God, being all mind and all Logos, so that Greek word for the word, Greek word for word, the Logos, again, extremely is a very detailed, very philosophically and metaphysically detailed subject, but the simplest point is that the Logos to the ancient Greeks before Christ was the underlying There's a whole host of words we could probably use in English that would require a lot of explanation, but probably you would say in English the best way here in this setting would be the underlying force, the underlying entity that not only created the world but upholds and maintains it. Now, to the ancient Greeks, it was an impersonal force. So like, electricity is an impersonal, it doesn't have personhood, it's not a mind. But the whole point of what happens when Christ comes, and this is why John's prologue, which I mentioned in the sermon this morning, is so important, is because the first time that someone's connecting the logos to personhood, right? Hence why he says in that prologue, enarche en logos, kai logos proston theon, kai theon en logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, en theon, was God. Okay? And then it talks about how this Word was made flesh and communed or tabernacled among us, and we have beheld his glory as of the only Father, begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth, etc. So there's this personal element to the Logos. So the Logos is not just merely for the ancient Greeks, the Logos that they were rightfully knowing and understanding what this was, just without the personal element. They were close, but not right there. This Logos was not just this Logos, this eternal element that created and upholds the world, is not just something like electricity, like we would say today, but rather is actually a person. It's a being, and it is Christ himself. Okay, so hence why he's saying here, but God being all mind, okay, an intelligence, an intelligent designer who thinks and who knows what he's doing, right? But God being all mind and all logos, both speaks exactly what he thinks and thinks exactly what he speaks. For his thought is logos, and logos is mind, and mind comprehending all things is the Father himself. Okay, he's speaking really directly to the Greek philosophical element, because that's where Gnosticism's coming from, right? It's this blending or this merging, what we would call a syncretism, a synchronization between the truth of Scripture and pagan Greek philosophy, especially in his day what was called Neoplatonism. And merging those two together, you end up corrupting the purity of the original truth, yeah? And so the logos, his thought, God's thought, is logos. The logos is mind, so it's an intelligence, a being, and the mind comprehending all things is the Father himself. We'll cover that more and what that means and stuff when we go through next week. So moving through to book 5, again following through there. For indeed the enemy would not have been fairly vanquished unless it had been a man born of a woman who conquered him. For it was by means of a woman that he got the advantage over man at first, setting himself up as man's opponent. Now, before we move there, he's speaking here about the nature of Christ, okay? And you'll see that by the time we finish the quotation. The point he's making here is that the devil would not have been truly conquered, truly vanquished, if indeed it was not a man who actually did the vanquishing. Why? He points out, it was through man that sin came into the world, that evil came into the world. It was man's rebellion against God. Hence, it was man who needed to make restitution for the rebellion. Okay, the New Testament, the apostles go into this ad infinitum. Okay, the incarnation wasn't just a good idea; it wasn't just a nice idea; it was a necessity. Right. So as you keep reading, and you'll get this on the next slide. And therefore, does the Lord profess himself to be the Son of Man, comprising in himself that original man out of whom the woman was fashioned, in order that, as our species went down to death through a vanquished man, Adam, so we may ascend to life again through a victorious one, Jesus. As through a man death received the palm of victory against us, so again by a man may we receive the palm of victory against death. Pretty profound wording. So this is doing what essentially the Apostle Paul does in Romans chapters 5 through 8. Okay, so chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8. That's what the Apostle Paul's doing there, where he's explaining that through one man did death enter the world, yet through one man is the world going to be reconciled. Okay? The incarnation is absolutely vital, because what's happening there is it's not just God in this nice mystical way just flicking away a magic wand and forgiving sins. okay, because it doesn't work that way, because justice doesn't work that way. That's how the capricious, tyrannical, arbitrary pagan gods work. Well, that's effectively what they do, especially in Greece. God bless them. That's what they did. No, justice doesn't just get to be dispensed with. Justice is objective, not arbitrary. It is official, not just whimsical. You don't just simply get to sweep things under the rug. Okay? It's what every other religion just doesn't get. That's what Christianity clearly does. It's one of the many unique points of Christianity. So reconciliation needs to be made. But in order to reconcile, there has to be representation. So God just didn't come down like he had before in the cloud, for example, in the fire and the smoke at Sinai. Right? He actually becomes a man. He's still fully God, but he then also becomes fully man. One person, so one being, not two, because then we'd fall into the kind of heresies that Irenaeus is talking about. One person, there's one Jesus, fully God and fully man at the same time. Okay? We are both spiritual and material. There's nothing ontologically different per se on that level. The difference is the spiritual element, I'm using that term in loose terms, not official terms, the spiritual element or nature of Jesus, to use the more specific word nature, is not just like ours. In fact, it is divine. It is the creator, the second person. Does that make sense? This is all vitally important. When I've talked about this before, this is, and I'm not going to do it here today because it would be way too long, obviously, but this is why when you see things like, and it's going to seem out of field, but it won't be, when you see hummings and ahhings, as we've seen for like the last 100 years about things like UFOs and aliens and other such things which have been going on since the Trinity test, and since things that in New Mexico with testing of nuclear weapons and going to the moon, all lots of such fascinating things, and the Americans right now are having all these hearings in the Senate about UFO sightings and other such apparent things. The basic Christian belief about that is complex, but the simplified element is that these things do not actually exist. Right? There are no aliens on other planets because, ironically, because of the incarnation. Okay? The fact that Jesus is fully God and fully man precludes there being any other creature that is being redeemed other than the man, as in like human beings. Okay? Redemption doesn't apply to animals because they're in no need of it. Animals are not inherently evil in any capacity, right? They live, they kill, they eat, but none of those are moral categories. Morality applies to human beings. Okay? The right now, as I'm speaking, as some lion is tearing apart some gazelle in the Serengeti over in Africa, there's nothing inherently good, there's nothing inherently bad, there just simply is. It's food. Okay. Morality is a human category. Man, humanity, is the one in need of salvation. The fact that humanity are the ones who are represented in the God-man precludes any other being from actually receiving redemption or even being in need of it, let alone being offered it. Okay, this is why we read so often, we talk about this as well, but this is why the powers of darkness hate light so much, because redemption is not offered to them. Okay? They are not represented in Christ, because redemption is not offered to them. Redemption is offered to us, if we would but submit ourselves to Christ. That, I'm laughing when I say this because it is kind of funny, but over the next 10 to 20 years, there are going to have to be sermons and probably sermon series on things like UFOs and aliens as people become familiar with and fascinated with this supposed concept and what the scriptures actually have to say about that. I'll leave it at that before we fly off on another palm. But read the final comment on this particular one, because I think this is really poetic and quite beautiful, actually. That last sentence there on that quotation you have on the screen in front of you. As through a man death received the palm of victory against us. Right, the palm of victory is it's calling to mind an Olympic champion, kind of like, or a great king, a great victor, a triumph, like how we celebrate Palm Sunday. Right, when Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, what do they lay down on the ground? Palms. Okay, palm leaves. As through a man death received the palm of victory against us, so again by a man, Christ, we may receive the palm of victory against death. The early church fathers were quite poetic, and they were quite articulate in the way that they explained the great beauty and mysteries of these things. So, to leave you with the final quotation there, it's on page 3 at the end. This is going to be from Book 4, chapter 18, section 5. This is specifically concerning, again, the full humanity, full deity of Christ, and the importance and centrality of that in the Eucharist, right, in Holy Communion. Okay? So Irenaeus says, quote, "For we offer to him his own," right, we offer to God his own, "announcing consistently the fellowship and union of the flesh and the spirit. For as the bread, which is produced from the earth, when it receives the invocation of God," right, so the words of institution like Michael and I do as the pastors here, "it no longer is common bread, but the Eucharist, consisting of two realities, earthly and heavenly. So also our bodies, when they receive the Eucharist," right, so when we take communion, "are no longer corruptible, but having the hope of the resurrection to eternity." Okay? I've explained this before. I explained this, it must have been in Polycarp, I'm guessing, from last lesson. But it's a point that will come up again consistently. Not even just Zwinglian sacramentalism, but the kind of memorial view which exists today in many evangelical churches, not all Protestant, but many evangelical ones, that what's going on there in communion is just simply us remembering in our brain back to the crucifixion, and there's nothing else. I said that last time, but this is just kind of going to be the consistent evidence going through. No one believed that. Okay? They did not believe it was just like an Anzac Day service, where you're just simply intellectually remembering something from the gospel story, in this case the Last Supper or the death, burial, resurrection. There is a genuine, real, spiritual work being done, again, not in some esoteric secret way, but by the Holy Spirit administering his grace, the grace that we have in Christ, to us through the bread and through the cup. Okay? It's what we call, in the broadest possible terms, the spiritual presence of Christ. Okay? So we as Protestants, rightfully so, because the early church didn't believe this either, we reject the later, much later Roman doctrine that comes up by the time you get to the late medieval period, so the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, of what's called transubstantiation, which is the belief that, contrary to this, if I or Michael as the pastors here were to say the words of invocation, that although not literally in front of you, but substantially, which is a complex term that goes back to Aristotle, the substance of that bread and wine are actually transformed into the real body and blood. Okay, that's a later aberration, not what the early church believed. So we're not doing some hocus pocus and a magical ritual that changes the substance of the elements. Okay, that's not what's going on there. We're not even remotely pretending to do that. You shouldn't be under any illusion that we're trying to do that. Okay, it's not a magic ritual. We're not doing anything, in fact. We have no grace to dispense to you. We have no ability to do anything. Instead, God is doing something. Not us, because we don't have any hocus pocus. Rather, what we are doing is acting in obedience of how this has been done, where, for starters, we're actually doing it, and we're doing it regularly, which is the testimony of the book of Acts and of the early church. They did this regularly, weekly. But what we are doing is that we are actually having Christ commune with us. That's why and we've explained this before, the symbolism, obviously the whole thing's tied up in symbolism, but which is a good thing, but one of the most symbolic parts is Michael and I, as the ministers of God presiding over that rite, taking the elements to you. Do you understand? Like, you know how we take the elements to you? It's not just because everyone's too lazy to get up and come down the front. It's actually the important symbolism of us in that portion of the liturgy. We are the representatives of God to you as pastors, right? Just as how we also represent you to God. Not because we're the mediators, but in Christ, we're under shepherds, underneath the great shepherd. Yeah? The symbolism of us taking the elements to you is because really in communion, what's going on there is it's God reaching out to us, not even the other way around necessarily, right? We're receiving the body and the blood of Christ, not because we've done some magic and transformed the substance, okay, so there's no hocus pocus, but rather we are spiritually joined to the body and the blood through those elements. That's what Irenaeus is saying here. It's what Polycarp said, or Ignatius, who we were talking about last time when we covered that. And that's what you're going to see going through. They didn't just believe it was just merely remembering something. It's one of the very few things the early church is actually unified in. The spiritual presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Because we're also not atheists, by the way. We're not atheists who just believe that there's nothing spiritual going on, that it's just all physical material and there's nothing spiritual at all. That's what atheists believe. We're not atheists, right? God works through material means. When he was rescuing the Israelites, for example, in the days of the Exodus, he parts the Red Seas. But does anyone remember how he does it? Yes, wind. He sends the east wind. Right, one of the cardinal winds, the east and the west wind, the major wind channels that run across the earth. He sends the east wind and it parts the seas. Okay, so he uses physical means to achieve spiritual objectives. You understand what I'm saying to you? All right, our salvation, like I pointed out earlier, especially when we were talking about the incarnation, which Irenaeus focuses on heavily, did God just wave a magic wand and just go, ta-da, you're all forgiven? Justice is done with because I arbitrarily said so. No. What does he do? Sends the second person, the Son, as a man, material means. See my point? God works through material means. He created the matter. He's the creator of the heavens and earth, and he uses the heavens and the earth to achieve his means, yes? To achieve what he desires. Make sense? Same thing's going on with communion. And I've preached on this before. You can go back. You need to go back through the pages, but you can find it on our website or on our YouTube channel. A sermon from early last year, early 2022, on communion, where I explain this in more broader detail. But the spiritual presence of Christ in the Eucharist or in communion, okay, where God just doesn't hocus pocus, magically give us grace in some way that no one can actually define. How are we brought into the church? Through baptism, okay? Through material means. That's why the apostles can then connect baptism to our salvation, to the point where Peter can say baptism now saves you. Not because of a washing of the flesh, which is his point, but because of the washing of the Spirit. That's the kind of language he's using, right? The physical, this is the way that the Reformers always encapsulated it, which is a very accurate way of doing it. The physical sign signifies the spiritual reality. I'll say that again. The physical sign signifies the spiritual reality. We are not joined to Christ just through arbitrary means that no one can actually define how that happens other than hocus pocus. Rather, we're brought into the church through physical means, our baptism. God's grace is administered to us, not just by some ethereal, unseen hocus pocus that no one can point to, but through communion. Go a year without communion and come back and report whether your life is better or worse. Okay? It's not going to be a good thing. Right? Go years and years and years without partaking of communion as a Christian, apart from the fact you'd be in disobedience, because Christ tells us to do it regularly, but apart from that, right, things would get worse in your life. Not because we're doing hocus pocus, that's the whole point. The whole point is it's not magic. It's the opposite, okay? It's God, who is spirit, who created the material world, using the material world to achieve his objectives. It's fairly logical, okay? Through that, this is what he's pointing to, right? We no longer, especially look at the sentence here, second sentence, for as the bread which is produced from the earth, so it's clearly physical, it's clearly material, when it receives the invocation of God, is no longer common bread, but the Eucharist consisting of two realities. Okay, so it doesn't lose its physical reality. That's the problem with transubstantiation, for the large part at least. It's earthly and heavenly. So also our bodies, when we receive the communion, right, the Eucharist, are no longer corruptible, but having the hope of the resurrection to eternity. Okay, we are joined to Christ by the grace of God, not by some magic from the pastors, but by the Spirit of God, as Christ communes with us here in a real way. We believe that when we are worshipping God, where two or three are gathered, there am I. Right, remember Christ saying that? Yeah. It's a corporate thing. It's not just me hidden off in the woods somewhere, right? It's when I'm joined together with the body of Christ that the head of that body, who is Christ, joins with us. Yes, and he does it through these various means. Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson. As I said, the actual specifics of those are just some quotations there, but the more specific outline, the structure, and some of the more important content that comes from Against Heresies by Irenaeus is what we'll specifically be focusing on next week. Okay, so does anyone have any questions or any clarifying things they want to have cleared up? Yes?
We nearly had a year without communion.
Say again?
We nearly had a year without communion.
Yeah, well, we did. Yeah, exactly. We had 4 months of 2020 plus the 6 months of 2021 where we didn't have communion. And this is not, obviously, I can't go into specifics, but throughout that time, even while Michael and I were still as on the the then interim pastoral team. Quite frankly, dealt with many problems that had arisen for people because their spiritual life, by the time they came back after 6 months of no church, no communion, no liturgy, for goodness sake, not even seeing each other, all those various things, the hymns, all the things which are spiritual nourishment to us, right? Which build community, literally and figuratively, were worse off after that 6 months than they were before. You asked Michael the same thing. It was blindingly obvious to us who were helping people on a personal level, especially by the time we came back. People were worse off than before. And any conversation I've ever had with fellow pastors since that, guys who I knew when I went to seminary, other people from the Baptist Union, the universal report. I'm yet to meet a single kind of fellow clergy friend of mine who hasn't had the exact same experience where their church was shut down for that 6 month period, especially the big lockdown in 2021, where everyone just came back and we're all just back on track now and smooth sailing and no dramas, as if we didn't go anywhere. Like no one had that experience at all. Because that's what happens when you shut down the lifeblood of an entire community for 6 months. But I suppose we should take solace because at least the bottle-o and the brothels were open. But anyway, the important things in life, not churches and community and spiritual health. Thanks for your comment. For you open up the Pandora's box of another Danielian rant. Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, I suppose. So any other questions or anything else that anyone needs clarified? Very good. Cool. He's holding Vicky's mouth shut. Yeah, very good. All right, you can ask me at home. All right, thank you, everyone. Next lesson, we'll keep going with part 2 of Irenaeus of Lyon. Thank you.